Thank you. So, the title of my talk is Storybook, What's New? I would like to get some questions after my talk, so these are the ways where you can reach me for questions, preferably the first one. If it's not a question, just a complaint, probably just dump it on Twitter. I usually start my slides with something depressing so I can work my way up. So this is my depressing slide, which I will be using later on as well. Building apps, building high-level complex applications that do REST calls and have data fetching, etc., like they do CRUD, or it's complicated. It's hard. You have to make so many decisions nowadays as a UI developer, UI engineer, like which framework do you choose, which state management library do you choose, what do you use for your backend? Do you use GraphQL? Do you use REST? What do you do? There's so many options there. And I'm going to be presenting about Storybook, and it's yet another option for you. So I want to take a little bit of a step back and start slow and talk about fear, uncertainty, and doubt that I think all of us are dealing with. At least I am. These are very common fears, uncertainty, and doubts. Like we have the fear of missing out. I have this. It's probably why I'm on Twitter still. You want to listen to what are the other smart people in the room doing? And should I be doing that as well? We have the uncertainty that we're working on something and we think it's really important, but is it? And we have to doubt, the very real doubt, whether our code is good enough. And by reflection, we might feel ourselves as not good enough. What are our fellow engineers going to say when they see my PR? These are my personal fears. So laying them out in front of the world for everyone to see. And it's kind of like my pyramid of doom. And these are real. I don't like public speaking, but I have a passion and I love to share it. Why do I say this? Why do I start my presentation with this fear, uncertainty, doubt, and having this huge downer? I think I skipped one or two. Because fear is the biggest hurdle that you have towards personal growth and organization success. It is not the manager that is telling you no. It is probably more likely you thinking that the manager is going to say no that is preventing you from growing and making improvements and changing people's minds. And the way I connect this to Storybook and the remainder of my talk, is kind of like two separate talks in my opinion. The way I connect it is that we have this fear of oh, I see this great thing at this one amazing conference that I've been, and I need to be doing that. I should have been doing that all along, this feeling of pressure. So I want to dial the knob a little back and state, you don't need to be doing this. It's just an option. If your current workflow works, you've got it better than I have, because I'm still figuring out what the right workflow is. But if you're having troubles with certain things that I'm going to be demonstrating, well, in that case, have a look at what I'm doing. So, who's giving you this advice? My name is Norbert de Langen. I live in the Netherlands. Fantastic place to be in. And I learned my craft with trial and error. I did not follow a college or university degree. I was taught this mostly by myself with lots and lots of errors. I worked my way up with very small cafe-like websites up until some point I was consulting for very big companies in the Netherlands. And now I work on for a small startup, and I maintain an open source library that that company relies on. And that project is obviously Storybook. So I would like for you to raise your hand if you've ever heard of Storybook. Like, fills me with joy to see that. And how many people use it? All right. So who didn't raise their hand because they don't like raising their hand in public? So no one, right? So there's a funny story about like how Storybook got to be and how I got to be involved and how I got to maintain it full-time, open source. I'm not the original author of Storybook. I'm not the person that came up with this great concept. In fact, Storybook was not the first implementation of this concept at all. But it grew quite popular, and so I was at some point introduced at one of the clients that I was consulting for. And what I saw at this client is that it solved a couple of their major issues and problems that I'd seen at other clients, and we had some ad hoc solutions to, and Storybook just gave them a kind of a nice place to consolidate all those issues and resolve them in one go. And these issues kind of feel unrelated, but they all come together. And the issue is like developing UI components and UIs is hard because their backend was kind of flaky. Sometimes it was down, sometimes the backend would update and like the data model changed. But also you need to like convince the backend that you really wanted this data with authorization tokens. And then if you've got like some different data you would like to feed into your UI, you'd kind of have to nicely ask the backend developers to kind of do a quick release to staging so you could get that data, delaying the process a lot. On the same side, same sort of problem, I had a problem with like getting UI components in a particular state without even the backend data. The data would just come from parent components. But it was still hard to get to. Why? Well, some components are just really buried deep into our applications. Think about a sign-up flow and all the steps that a user needs to do to see the final amazing animation that you've been working on for a day. You only see that animation for a second. It's an amazing animation still, but like it's only there for a second. How do you develop that animation and make it great if it's buried so deep in your application? And by design, it only shows up once when you do the entire sign-up flow. You can kind of, you know, put it on the home page for a second, right? Who's done that? You just put a random component on the home page and, you know, develop it like that. You can do it. And then another problem that I've been having is like, which component do I use? I'm new to the team. I don't know much about the context of this 150,000 lines code base. I just know I need to create this design. Which components are there and available? It's a documentation problem. So my client was using Storybook. I learned this, and I saw that Storybook solved these problems in a way for them. And I saw it removed quite a bit of the fear, uncertainty, and doubt in developing applications. You don't fear that you've accidentally forgotten to remove that component from the home page. Who's done that? I have. What's this button doing on the home page? Whoops! And to bring like the whole fear, uncertainty, and doubt thing again, have you ever built something and feared that maybe someone else had already built it, or was already building it at another team, the exact same functionality? Do you fear, like, if I put this in the code base and it is already there somehow in another place, because we have no standard somewhere to place features? You're adding to the technical debt. This is something that, like, whenever I hear technical debt, I was like, oh no. Because it's something that we fear. And do you fear, like, becoming the sole proprietary owner of this piece of code that you've injected into the code base? I've written, for example, this carousel component once, and because my name was attached to that git commit, everyone would start asking me questions, even though I had not really been using that carousel component anymore. But everyone just keep asking me questions, and worst of all, they would keep asking me, like, to add more features to it, even though I had stopped using it. So if you're weighing your options, like, if I write this component, do I tell everyone in the organization about it? Because I might, like, get flamed for not writing it in a proper way. I might get burdened with all the support tickets from the other teams. You could consider just having the safety to build it and then shut up about it. But you shouldn't. So, back to my story about Storybook. I was working on their Storybook, and I was developing an add-on for them. And one day, I got a message from one of the Storybook people that I was connected with, and they told me, hey, Norbert, we've been kind of collaborating on this new add-on. You had some good ideas, and we've been implementing together. But, I don't think I'm going to be spending any more time on this because the original authors of Storybook abandoned it. It's now unmaintained. And I'm like, this client is, like, really happy with it. I was already thinking about my next client. I'm definitely going to introduce this. So do I tell them, like, you have to freeze this and start using some other tool? There were some other tools, obviously, around. This is JavaScript. Every solution has been implemented 1 million times. I thought to myself, no. I've done some swimming in the sea of open source, like, never taken a deep dive, but, I haven't drowned so far. So I figured I'll post on GitHub stating that if the authors are looking for a new maintainer, I can try. I can do that. Sure. And so the next morning, I was greeted with an email from GitHub stating that I was the new administrator on the Storybook organization. I did not have any handoff or anything. It's just like, all right, it's yours. I felt like I was called on my bluff because, honestly, I didn't really anticipate that happening like that. So what I did was I just opened the Google Hangout, and I started to get everyone I could that was vaguely interested in Storybook and that maybe contributed to the code base at some point. I started inviting them in, and, like, at some point we had like 12 people in a Google Hangout, and everyone just started introducing each other. And this is how we build or rebuild the Storybook core team. Funny thing is, that meeting I recorded and put on YouTube, and it's still available. So if you want to see, like, that moment in time where super awkward 12 people are like, so what's going to happen? You can watch that. I just wanted someone to maintain Storybook because I thought it was useful. I didn't really go in with a plan like, I'm going to be the guy that's going to refactor the entire Storybook code base. But what ended up happening is that these 12 people were just really awesome. It was just so much fun to be working with them, and it provided my like technical brain with new challenges to overcome. Like Storybook's code base at that point were 30 plus repos, and I merged them all into one monorepo, and taught everyone how to deal with monorepos, because that's not easy too. And then at some point, I think about 2 years later, I had been maintaining Storybook in my free time. A company called Chroma approached me asking me, hey, we have a product and our users must be using Storybook. That's a requirement for them to be like paying us money for our product. And so we have a need for Storybook to be good, fast, and grow, and just spread around the globe. We're looking for someone that can help us with that. Would you like to do it? It's like, so you're offering me a job where I can work from home on the product that I was working on anyway. It was not a difficult choice. And so they asked me, like, all right, Storybook needs to grow. And yeah, that's what's happening. I don't know if you can see the downtime where NPM had, because these are NPM installs. I don't know if you can spot it. And so it's really awesome, like we're about to hit 1 million installs per week. It's probably going to happen next week. So that's like, it's just crazy how much it's grown, how much popularity it's gotten. And here's like, I don't really like showing it because I don't think of like the Storybook alternatives as like competition. I would rather like collaborate and share the tools. But here's how Storybook kind of compares in terms of NPM installs with React Style Guide Dist and Doxy. And here's like just some of the amazing companies that are using Storybook. I just added Spotify 5 minutes ago because Iris showed me that they were using Storybook. Okay, so what is Storybook and what are like modern UIs? We've got tons and tons of UI frameworks nowadays. The big three: React, Angular, Vue, but there are others, like for example, Ember, Riot, Marco, Mithril, Svelte, and just plain old HTML components. And that's just a few. Like we support 12 different view layers in Storybook. And I think this is really important. Like I don't think any other utility library or tool like Storybook is doing this. And I think it's, yeah, like I said, it's really important for us. It didn't really start out like that. Literally, why we support Vue is because I was attending a Vue meetup in Amsterdam, and someone said Vue is cool, and I was like, well, I've got nothing else to do on the way back on the train, so maybe I can write a Storybook for Vue. I could, like when I got home, I got something working, so that kind of set in motion what's now very core to our idea, is that we want to bring these different communities that are kind of walled off from each other. We want to bring them together. And one of our ideas that you are using Storybook, you're documenting and writing components in an isolated way. And then you don't have to fear that if you ever migrate to another view layer, that you have to rediscover the tool, because we want to support every framework out there. So developers, their main task-ish is to translate the design assets to something that actually works. This is usually how design is done. It is a really big, either sketch or some other big file with lots of screens on it. And then a developer looks at this and like, we kind of slice it up, but in a sense, we are decomposing the screen into components. And then what we want to do is kind of catalog all the relevant states of those components. And then be able to kind of interact with any component that we choose. Just take it, put some data in it, and then look at it. So on the left is what Storybook kind of looks like, and you can add all sorts of add-ons. For example, here, we've got an add-on to play around with the data currently flowing into a component. And then UI engineers or developers, they take multiple components, create like composed components, which leads to screens. So that's kind of the process of you've got a big screen design, decompose them into components, compose the components together into bigger components, you compose the big components into screens. That's what Storybook is about. You build the components in isolation. You create definitions for this component, this data, that's a good combination. And you catalog all of that. And we have all sorts of community add-ons, plus 20 at this point, that extend the functionality of Storybook. Some of those add-ons don't really make sense to combine together, but that's fine. We think it's just fine to have some sort of competition between like which add-on is a good idea, which one is not. Do you need viewports? Well, we got an add-on for that. Do you like different backgrounds, etc.? Well, that's what add-ons are for. This process I tend to call component-driven development. So you create components. You don't like this step of like, okay, what can I decompose this into? Can I decompose it even more? At some point, the answer is no, and then you recompose back. And you try to optimize somewhat for reusability, though it's not a golden standard to have everything reusable. So in a nutshell, that's what Storybook is about. Let's see the new stuff. It works about 50% of the time, so. All right, so if you're using React, then in your stories, you can now just use hooks, which has been requested a lot. Makes it quite a bit easier to make kind of concise stories. You can now sort your stories to your heart's content. In fact, it's a function, so you are about as much as in control as you could be. It's essentially just a sort function. A, B turns to a -1, 0, or +1. I'm kind of, the order of like these changes is like not really interesting to really interesting, so kind of building up some hype. TypeScript, 52% of our code base is now TypeScript. That includes unit tests, which we don't really think TypeScript is too valuable for. Might do it at some point when you have like time to spare. But it means like if you install @storybook/react or @storybook/view, you get the types. Which means that if you are writing your stories with TypeScript, you can assert that they're correct. Like you cannot try and render something that is unrenderable with Vue or React. It also was quite a debate for us, like whether that's a breaking change or not. You can imagine that before, if you install Storybook/React or anything, any Vue layer, the types are any. TypeScript doesn't know. And so now it's all of a sudden it's quite strict, and people's builds, they break because of that if there's a mismatch. So it's a breaking change or not. We decided that it wasn't. I'm sorry if it breaks your shit. We have new add-on APIs. We think it's just fantastic if people contribute to the core of Storybook, but it's even greater if you can kind of get your own control and you don't need to wait for other people to approve the stuff, which is why we have an add-on API. You can create add-ons that are private to your organization. You can publish them to the world. If you do, we would love to know about it so we can help you promote it. And so we've improved the situation for add-on creators, so it's much easier. Common things to do, this is the Storybook UI, and just to give you, I know this is the last talk, so I tried to keep the how very low. There is a little bit of how coming up, but most of my talk is why and what. So coloring, not great. If you can see, there's this blue hue over this area in the middle. This is what in Storybook code we call the preview. It's where your code runs. So you write a component, you write a story, it runs right there. In a sense, Storybook is actually two applications running in parallel, your code and our code. Our code we call the manager because it manages which story you're currently looking at. It manages the state of the add-ons. It doesn't manage what is actually being rendered in the iframe. And yes, it's an iframe because otherwise media queries would not work. CSS would leak because that's what CSS does. You would have font issues. You would have things like position fixed, just being all over the place, literally. And so it's an iframe which gives you isolation. That's what Storybook promises. But it also gives you a massive load of pain as a developer. So on the top is something that we call the toolbar. That was introduced in version 5. And as an add-on developer, you get to inject any component you want in there. So it's usually like a little button or a little drop-down because space is limited right there. But it sticks there throughout all of your stories. So you could write an add-on that kind of changes the viewport size. You could write an add-on that changes the background color, things like that. Then we have the Explorer that's on the left. This is where you currently are not really able to do anything with Storybook, but hopefully in the future that is something that I'm open to extending, so you can maybe wrap that place to kind of visualize or style it a little bit better, the way you want. And then very importantly, on this bottom part, we've got something that we call the panel, which is probably not very descriptive. But you can inject additional panels in there that, for example, I don't know, just anything you want, really. In this current example, what it's doing is it renders a bunch of input fields, and when you type or change the value of those input fields, it re-renders your component with that data instead. Now, so there's stuff happening in the toolbar, there's stuff happening in the panel, there's stuff happening in the Explorer. We need to communicate and send commands over to this iframe. And this is something that we do with post messages. And to kind of abstract that, created something that's called the channel. So this is why I mentioned it, like the add-on API for talking with this channel used to be very verbose, and it's still probably, well, it fits on one slide, but it's probably not the best, but it used to be a lot worse. And so you can use things like, I could have used a better color, I guess. You can use channel and then post in like all the events that you're interested in, and you can start emitting events. All right, the how part of my presentation is done. So this is huge. Like I said, I'm kind of building up the importance of these features. Documentation in Storybook has always been kind of lacking. We've had some add-ons to help you create documentation for components. In version 5.2, which is available today, you get this. It is an auto-generated style guide right from your components. So you don't have to do anything to get this from Storybook today. All you have to do is install the add-on. If this is not enough for you, if you want documentation even more control, we support MDX now. So you can write an MDX file, Storybook can view that MDX file, and you can even create stories right in this MDX file, or reference other stories, which will then render in an iframe or inline, whatever you want. Storybook Docs is built with something that we call doc blocks. And these are available to you even if you're not using Storybook. So these are like the canvas, props, and the type you can read. And this is what one of those MDX files could look like. It's a minimalistic example. You understand, I have only so much space on the slide. But you import some important things from Storybook add-on docs. You import your own components because you want to document your component, you should be importing it. And then you write your documentation, and then you write a story. And as I said, you can also give this story component an ID of a story that you've written elsewhere, and Storybook will figure out where that thing is. So raise your hand if you want your components built and viewed in isolation. If you want to get examples-based documentation, and if you want to have full control, use MDX. Yeah, same. All right, I think the biggest thing so far, the biggest change that we've done in Storybook since forever is this. The component story format is a new way of writing stories. We've reversed the flow of like how stories operate internally. Previously, you had to write like an imperative API and you would inject stories into Storybook. This format is declarative, and so it exposes stories to the outside world. The big change is that it is now no longer tied to Storybook. You've got a format to define component variances, and it's, again, not tied to Storybook at all. This is what such a component story format file would look like. As you can see, it's a default export where you export the metadata. Like this is about like, what are we documenting? And then every other export is essentially a story. The reason why it's taken so long is because we didn't really want to release this without a good migration path for you. And so we have code mods that will essentially take, and we've done it on our own code base because you can imagine how many stories we had. I'll show you later. To take a code base and migrate it over to CSV in a few commands, maybe one. Unless you're doing something really dynamic, like generating stories, you cannot do that in an ES module. The exports are static, which is also great because now I can do lots of optimization because it's statically analyzable. So that kind of brings me into the future of Storybook. Embedding stories in other docs sites. So Gatsby and Next are super popular to document anything, including components. And so we want to leverage and allow you to kind of make a built version of Storybook that you can then inject into other places. And partially, you can already do this with the docs blocks I mentioned. Editing code from within Storybook. So imagine a version of Storybook that you've built as a static site and deployed somewhere on something like Netlify or something. And you're still able to kind of play around with the code and see, like, what if I change this map to a reduce? Like, does that help, or does that still work? Just more level up of the playground that Storybook can be for you. And something that we're working on also is being able to export a story into Code Sandbox. The way we've kind of set it up, because this just didn't quite make the cut for 5.2, it was not stable enough. The way it's set up is like it's not super tied to Code Sandbox, so we're like super interested in getting more people to help us with maybe other suppliers of these sandbox tools. Something that is like a bane of my existence since forever, since I started maintaining Storybook, is the way it's configured. There's this config.js file. If you've ever used Storybook, you know this file, and it is a freaking mess. It is imperative, and you configure things, I don't know, it's just really bad, because what you're essentially doing is you're configuring the preview application. And that configuration then has to make its way into the manager via this post message I told you about. And things like theming, not great. So something that I've worked on for quite some while, but technically it's very boring to explain about, is like declarative configuration, which should be easy to use, easy to understand, and very easy to extend. So this is like what it would look like for users. Again, it's just an ES module. It exports things. And I'm hoping that maybe someday when I actually finish this damn thing, it might be useful for other tools other than Storybook as well. But I need to finish it first. One universal Storybook. So if you're migrating from one framework to another, you might have a need for this. If you currently use Angular components and React components together, you gotta have two storybooks. A single storybook can only render in one view layer. And that was really because of me. This train trip home, I just copy and pasted the entire React thing, called it view, replaced the React dependency to view dependency, and fixed it. So it's a copy and paste problem. Yeah, we need to fix that. We need to make sure that it can actually run. Again, this didn't quite make it to the 5.2 release. It will likely make it to the 5.3 release. So I'm excited about that. Coverage. Iris, the previous speaker, she was talking about like testing, and she mentioned Storybook. Thank you for that. Stories are kind of like tests, but you don't really make any assertions. The assertion that you make is like, it should render. It should just be injected in a DOM and work between air quotes, because it just shouldn't throw an error. That's all you're doing. And developers like measuring things, right? So one of the very often used metric is code coverage. Turns out that you can calculate story coverage as well, because they're kind of like tests. My colleague, Michael Shillman, he's got a work in progress concept of like showing which components and how much story coverage you've got on them, right in Storybook itself. And that brings me back to this slide. Remember this one all the way in the beginning? You've got one component, you've got 4 stories, you got 4 browsers, that's already 16 tests. Then you've got 4 viewports, that's 64 tests. And do you want to test whether the component in that particular state, in that particular viewport, is accessible for colorblind people, for people that use the screen reader? That's a lot of tests. I cannot really imagine people doing that by hand. And that's currently what you have to do in Storybook, right? You cannot really ask a machine, can you assert that all of these stories rendered correctly? Except you can. So full disclosure, the company that is paying my full-time salary to work in Storybook full-time is Chroma, and this is their product. So take my advice with any sort of grains of sand or salt that you want. I think it's great, but obviously I'm biased. We use it at Storybook, so if you're skeptical, you can see this working for a large, complex application, and it just open for the world to see what it does. Like what Iris showed us before, if you've seen that talk, it was great. You missed it, that's too bad. You kind of want visual review. It's not like testing, it's like change detection, but it's really good change detection. If you can assert that visually nothing changed, I get a lot of confidence from that. If I make a change in one component, and then I see that everywhere where that component is used, it actually updates, gives me a lot of confidence. And that's what tests are about, deploying with confidence. So this is almost my last slide. Like I said, I would show you for Storybook how many tests we've got. Notice how fast that time was. So that is what this product excels at. It knows about Storybook, it's fully integrated with it. And yeah, it can just parallelize the shit out of Storybook snapshotting. So my final slide, I just saw the 1 minute sign. I want to thank Chroma for helping me do this. I want to help the conference organizers. But most of all, I really want to thank the people that work in Storybook with me. I would not be here without them. And thank you for listening.
Okay, while we're at it, I don't think that anyone has something against prolong a little bit for a couple of more minutes and answering some questions because it was a real battle of upvoting questions. So just to
bring him.
Yeah. The question number 1: what would you recommend to try first for those who didn't use Storybook before?
I imagine you have a large, complex application, but you've got components. Like that's my current assumption to answer this question, because I need to narrow it down a little bit. You got a component, and it's props, or it's data flowing in. It's really simple. Just use our CLI to add Storybook to your current project. It should automatically detect if it's a framework or view layer that it supports. It should bootstrap correctly. Just add your first story for that component. In particular, you should probably start where it hurts. So the components that you feel like uncertain about, or just any component that you're adding. Something that I've heard quite often is like, well, I wasn't using Storybook from day one, so it kind of feels pointless to me. No, you've got to start somewhere. So that would be my answer. Just start with the component you're currently working on, or the component that hurts you the most.
Okay, thank you. Next one. Actually, we have like 2 or 3 questions that revolve around the same thing. How would one join you?
Like on the Storybook?
Yeah, contributing.
Yeah. So I wanted to mention it, but like I mostly do these talks kind of like loosely. So that first roadmap meeting that we had on Google Hangout, that's actually something that I still do. I think getting people involved with open source and getting involved people and other view layer and engine developers involved with Storybook is really important. And it's something that I actually love to do. I don't know those 12 frameworks. In fact, like I hardly know any Angular at all. But we do get it done, and we do get it maintained and stabilized-ish, because we are just a big community of people that all know their individual piece, and we work together.
Okay, thank you.
So if you want to join the Storybook team, just ask me, and I'll onboard you.
Fair enough. So this is more of a request. Would you mind showing the slide with companies using Storybook again, please? Question mark, smiley face.
The smiley face does it. There we go.
Ta-da. Okay, we can leave this on and
Sure.
just proceed with questions. Next one. Do you get open source fatigue, or being full-time open sourcer solves this?
Yes and no. Everyone gets bored of monogamous work. Everyone. It's normal. Thing I do is, because I work from home, I just go downstairs and play with my 5-year-old, like play with Lego or anything she likes, drawing, and then like at some point go back to work. I'm privileged enough to have that ability to kind of do my own schedule. I also work 50 or 60 hours a week, so I mean, pick your poison. But I don't really feel it as work. For the last 2 weeks or so, I've actually worked on a feature for Chroma, like inside of their repository. I was able to extract some code into an open source package. So that's, yeah, find other things that you're interested in. Don't spend all your time on one project. And if you're fatigued about like what I said in the beginning, about like fear of missing out, or fear that you should be using all these new fancy tech, just take it easy. No one demands you to know all this stuff.
Okay, thank you. So next one, how Storybook plays with different component organization patterns, for example, feature-based grouping.
Can the the person who asked that question maybe elaborate a little bit?
Okay, well, we will leave that for after the talk. If
Yeah, ask me after.
Yeah, so let's switch to the next one. Which framework was the trickiest to support?
I don't know, because I didn't implement them all. That's what the community does. I just gave the first like little kick to get the view ball rolling, and then I assisted the person and motivated the person. I think Carlos Vega. He did the Angular 2 one, and then like the third or fourth one just kind of appeared in a PR. What I usually do is I help those PRs get merged, because they're big and they're hard to review, because no one really... For example, imagine in your company, someone opens a PR that migrates your entire stack over to something else. Who's going to review that? There's probably no one else in your company that knows how to like do the thing in that framework. And that's the situation we face every time there's a new framework added. But at the same time, it's the new package. So, you know, we're kind of free to give it a try and call it beta software.
Okay, 3 last questions, short ones. Does Storybook support the web components?
Yes.
Okay,
including like lit HTML and Polymer.
Okay. Second one, what is your favorite feature of Storybook?
I hate it and I like it. It's the iframe feature. So the fact that the component is in actual isolation. I used to be like a huge React style guidist proponent. I used it everywhere, but it lacks the iframe feature. And maybe it's like just 5% of my components that do something tricky. But if CSS leaks, it is really hard to catch. And you might have been depending for years on that leaky CSS, and now all of a sudden you fix the leak, and everything is kind of flawed. And like you can find those problems really late and hard.
Okay, thank you. The last one. Where would you like to see Storybook go from here?
Just be better and faster, get more add-ons. I don't know, like the sky is the limit, right? Every framework supported, a really active community of all those people. I think like for me, like it really motivates me, the concept of this add-on to do media queries and viewports really well, and that being used by Angular developers and Vue developers and React developers, and then them collaborating together to make that add-on better. I think like that is just that's the thing I want to work on. That's just so amazing to see those communities that are somewhat hostile to each other. At least that's how it can appear. But they are just of different mindset often, but they do have very similar problems, and then they can collaborate, and that's amazing to see happen.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.